I was at 18,000 feet above the Solomon Islands when I saw the sky tear open like silk under a sword stroke, when the morning light fractured into geometry that shouldn't exist in nature, and my Zero shuddered beneath me not from turbulence or enemy fire, but from some disturbance in the air itself, some wake or pressure wave that preceded the thing I was about to witness. And through the oil-streaked canopy, I could see him coming. This American pilot in a Corsair that looked fresh from the factory. No combat scars, no veteran markings, just clean paint and the kind of flight path that suggested someone who didn't know the rules, because nobody had taught him yet that certain maneuvers were impossible, that physics imposed limits on what aircraft could do and survive. And he was diving through cloud layer at an angle so steep it looked vertical, looked like he was falling rather than flying. And then, at what should have been the moment of impact, with the cloud bank he rolled. Not a gentle aileron roll, but something violent and instantaneous that left a contrail slicing through the white vapor, like a blade through paper. And the sky actually opened, actually separated along that line he'd drawn with his aircraft. And through the gap I could see blue on the other side, could see the way sunlight poured through this impossible cut he'd made in the clouds. And my wingman Nakamura made a sound over the radio that wasn't language, wasn't anything human, just the noise a man makes when his understanding of reality breaks. And the American rookie kept moving, kept executing turns that created these razor-line contrails that divided the sky into sections, into geometric shapes that looked designed rather than natural. And where those lines intersected, my squadron mate's aircraft, things happened that I still can't explain. Fighters spinning out of control without visible damage, pilots ejecting from cockpits in panic, the entire formation dissolving in seconds because we'd trained to fight enemies who followed the same rules we followed. And this pilot was operating under different rules entirely, rules written in language we couldn't read. And I understood in that moment that we'd lost something more important than a battle. We'd lost the certainty that our training and experience mattered, that the sky belonged to us because we'd earned it through discipline and sacrifice. Because this rookie with his impossible angles and his blade cuts through clouds had just demonstrated that talent could eclipse everything we'd built our superiority on. If you're watching this, stay until the end and subscribe. Some memories shouldn't die with us. To understand why that moment shattered everything we believed about the sky, we need to go back to Yokosuka in 1938, to the Naval Air Station where I first saw a Zero and understood that I was looking at perfection, at the distilled essence of what aircraft could be if you prioritized the right qualities and accepted the necessary compromises. I'd grown up in Osaka, son of a silk merchant who wanted me to inherit his business, who saw aviation as dangerous frivolity for young men with more courage than sense. But I'd watched demonstration flights at local airfields and had felt something shift in my chest when I saw how aircraft moved, how they transformed three-dimensional space into poetry, written with altitude and speed and the arc of a well-executed turn. I'd joined the Navy against my father's wishes in 1936, had survived flight training that killed nearly a third of our class, had learned to see the sky not as empty space, but as terrain, with its own geography, its own tactical opportunities and dangers. And when they assigned me to the newly formed Zero Squadron, I felt like I'd been chosen for something historic, like I was going to be part of the generation that established Japan's dominance over the Pacific through pure aerial superiority. The Zero was a machine that demanded respect and gave loyalty in return, light enough to outmaneuver anything the Americans or British could field, with range that allowed us to escort bombers further than enemy fighters could pursue, and in the early years of the war we were invincible, with a sword edge of Japanese expansion, clearing the skies above invasion fleets and bombing formations, and I accumulated kills the way some men accumulated medals. each victory a confirmation that our training system worked, that the spiritual discipline we'd been taught, the focus on perfection through repetition, the acceptance of death as a possible outcome of any engagement, gave us advantages that technology alone couldn't match. We fought over China first, over cities whose names I learned to pronounce by bombing them. And the Chinese pilots were brave but poorly trained, flying aircraft that were outdated before they reached the front lines, and we cut through them like farmers harvesting rice, methodical and efficient, and feeling something that wasn't quite pride, because pride suggested equality between opponents, and there was no equality in those skies, just predators and prey, and the natural order that emerged when one side had every advantage. My squadron became family, in the way that military units become family when you trust each other with your lives daily. When you've seen each other at your worst and your best and everything between, and we developed the particular intimacy that comes from shared danger, shared purpose. The knowledge that any morning briefing might be the last conversation you'd have with the men sitting next to you drinking tea and making jokes about the quality of the rice, or the temperature of the barracks, or anything except the obvious fact that we were all gambling with death every time we climbed into our cockpits. Nakamura was my wingman for 3 years, had this habit of singing folk songs over the radio during long patrols when we were supposed to maintain radio silence, and the squadron leader would yell at him but never punished him because we all knew the singing helped, made the hours of vigilance bearable, reminded us that we were human beings with memories and futures rather than just weapon systems piloting aircraft. There was Tanaka, who'd been a university student studying literature before the war and who would quote poetry during dogfights, would recite verses about cherry blossoms and impermanence while executing deflection shots that required calculating lead angles and closure rates. And there was Yoshida, who never spoke about his family, but who carried photographs he'd touch before every mission like prayer beads. And there was Suzuki, who'd survived a bailout over jungle and had walked 40 miles back to base, and who afterward flew with particular aggression, like he was angry at the sky itself for trying to kill him. But as the war progressed, we started noticing changes, started seeing American aircraft improve, started encountering pilots who'd learned from their early mistakes and were implementing tactics that neutralized our advantages. And the kill ratios that had been so favorable in 1942 began shifting, began equalizing, and we started losing aircraft not to superior technology, but to superior numbers, to the Americans' ability to replace every loss with 2 new aircraft, while we struggled to replace every loss with 1. And the replacements we did get were increasingly young, increasingly poorly trained, because Japan no longer had time or resources for the extended training cycles that had produced our generation of pilots. We heard rumors from other squadrons about American pilots who flew differently, who developed new tactics that our doctrine hadn't prepared us for. Things like the thatch weave, where 2 aircraft would support each other in ways that made them almost impossible to attack individually. And we adapted, developed counter-tactics, but the adaptation was reactive rather than innovative. Was us responding to American initiative rather than imposing our own will on the engagement, and that shift felt significant in ways that went beyond tactical details, felt like we'd lost the strategic momentum that had carried us through the war's early years. By 1944, we were hearing stories that sounded like myths, stories about American pilots who flew like they'd been born in cockpits, who could look at a combat situation and instantly understand the optimal solution in ways that suggested instinct rather than training. And the stories always described these pilots the same way, as rookies with minimal flight hours who somehow performed like veterans, who made decisions that shouldn't be possible for someone with their limited experience. And initially, we dismissed these stories as propaganda or exaggeration, or the natural tendency of defeated men to inflate their opponents' capabilities to excuse their own failures. But the stories kept coming, kept accumulating, and they had details that suggested truth, descriptions of specific maneuvers and tactical choices that were too consistent across multiple accounts to be fabrication. And I started wondering if maybe the Americans had developed some new training system that could compress years of experience into months of instruction, or if maybe they'd identified some selection criteria that allowed them to find natural pilots, the way you might find natural musicians or natural mathematicians, people who had abilities that couldn't be taught because they were innate rather than learned. The mission briefing that morning had covered the usual tactical details: patrol coordinates, expected enemy strength, rules of engagement, but the intelligence officer had added something unusual at the end, had mentioned that reconnaissance had spotted a single American fighter operating alone in our sector. No wingman, no supporting element, just one aircraft conducting what appeared to be either a training flight or some kind of familiarization patrol. And he'd suggested that we might want to intercept it, because solo aircraft made easy targets, and we needed the morale boost that came from confirmed kills after 2 weeks of inconclusive engagements where we'd burned fuel and ammunition without achieving anything except survival. The squadron leader had assigned 3 of us to the intercept: myself, Nakamura, and Yoshida, figuring that 3 zeros against 1 American was overwhelming force that guaranteed success, while freeing the rest of the squadron to continue the primary patrol. And we'd taken off into morning light that turned the ocean below into hammered metal, into surface that hurt to look at directly, but which provided perfect backdrop for spotting aircraft, because anything moving across that brightness would show as dark silhouette. We climbed to 18,000 feet, where the air was thin enough that breathing required conscious effort despite the oxygen system, where every movement felt sluggish because your brain wasn't getting quite enough oxygen to function at full capacity. And we settled into wide formation that gave us visual coverage of the entire sector, while keeping us close enough to support each other if the intercept turned into actual combat. The clouds that morning were unusual, were forming in layers that created corridors between different altitudes, and sunlight was hitting them at angles that made them look solid, made them look like you could walk on them if you were foolish enough to try. And the light itself had particular quality that I'd learned to associate with dangerous flying conditions, this sharp clarity that made distances deceptive, made objects appear closer or further than they actually were, and I mentioned this to Nakamura, who agreed that the visibility was tricky, but pointed out that tricky visibility affected the American as much as it affected us, which was true, but which didn't entirely ease the tension I was feeling. This sense that something about the morning was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. We spotted him at 30 miles, spotted the contrail first before we could see the actual aircraft, and the contrail was strange, was forming patterns that suggested erratic flight rather than steady course, and initially I thought maybe the American was lost or was having mechanical problems. But as we closed distance, I realized the erratic pattern was deliberate. Was the American practicing maneuvers, executing rolls and loops and turns that left these geometric traces in the sky, and I could see that he was good. Could see from the precision of those traces that whoever was flying that aircraft had natural ability, even if he lacked experience, had the kind of instinctive understanding of how aircraft moved that couldn't be taught, could only be refined through practice. We moved into attack position without being noticed, came at him from above and behind where his visibility would be worst, and I armed my guns and prepared for what should have been a simple deflection shot against an opponent who didn't know we were there. But Yoshida's voice came over the radio with a warning tone that made me hesitate, said something felt wrong about the way the American was moving, said it looked like someone who was deliberately exposing himself as bait, and I looked more carefully at the American's flight path and realized Yoshida was right. The American was flying too predictably, was maintaining altitudes and headings that made him easy to track, and that suggested either incompetence or trap. The clouds were creating these narrow vertical corridors where light poured through gaps in the layers, creating columns of illuminated air separated by shadow. And the American was moving between these columns in ways that made him flash in and out of visibility, bright, then dark, then bright again. And I realized he was using the light columns as reference points, was building a mental map of where they were and how they related to each other, and that level of spatial awareness suggested someone who thought in 3 dimensions naturally, who could hold complex geometry in his mind while simultaneously flying aircraft and watching for threats. I called off the attack, told Nakamura and Yoshida that we needed to observe longer, needed to understand what we were dealing with before committing to engagement, and they acknowledged with the kind of reluctant agreement that meant they thought I was being overcautious, but trusted my judgment enough to follow orders, and we circled at distance, watching the American practice his maneuvers, watching him execute rolls that were so fast they looked violent, that looked like he was trying to break his own aircraft through aggressive control inputs. But the aircraft responded smoothly, responded like it was an extension of his body rather than a machine he was operating. Then he saw us. Or maybe he'd known we were there all along and had been waiting for us to reveal ourselves. And he stopped practicing and turned toward us with acceleration that seemed impossible given his altitude and speed, turned so sharply that he should have bled energy and stalled, but instead seemed to gain speed. And I felt something cold settle in my chest because I was watching someone break rules that I'd thought were absolute, was watching physics become negotiable in the hands of someone who didn't know he wasn't supposed to be able to do what he was doing. He came at us head-on, which was suicide in normal circumstances. Head-on attacks gave both sides opportunity to fire, but favored the aircraft with heavier armament, and the Zero was lightly armed compared to American fighters, relied on maneuverability rather than firepower, and I prepared to break left while Nakamura and Yoshida broke right so we could bracket him and force him to choose which element to engage. But he didn't give us time to execute the maneuver, didn't wait for us to establish position, just kept coming straight at us with the kind of certainty that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing, even if what he was doing made no tactical sense. At the last possible moment before collision, he rolled, executed a barrel roll so precise that his aircraft traced a perfect helix through the air, and as he rolled he was firing, was somehow managing to track us through the rotation and place cannon rounds with accuracy that should have been impossible when you were inverted and rotating and dealing with the disorientation that came from having the horizon spin around you. And I felt impacts on my Zero's wing, felt the aircraft shudder from hits that punched through aluminum and exited the other side. And I was so shocked by the impossibility of what he'd just done that I almost forgot to brake, almost flew straight into his fire, because my brain was still trying to process how someone could hit a maneuvering target while executing a barrel roll that was so fast it left visual afterimage in my perception. Yoshida wasn't as lucky, took hits directly in the engine cowling, and his Zero started trailing smoke immediately. Started that particular black smoke that meant oil was burning, and engine failure was imminent, and he was calling over the radio that he'd lost power and was attempting to glide to the nearest island. And I wanted to escort him, but I couldn't, because the American had reversed and was coming around for another pass, and if I didn't engage him, he'd shoot Yoshida during his vulnerable glide. I turned into him, tried to use the Zero's superior turning radius to get inside his turn circle and force an overshoot, but he matched me, matched my turn rate despite flying an aircraft that was heavier and should have turned slower, and I realized with growing horror that he was simply better than me, was flying with confidence and precision that came from talent rather than training, was making the kinds of instantaneous decisions that I'd spent years learning to make, and he was doing it naturally, like breathing. Nakamura tried to support me, tried to get position on the American's tail while I kept him occupied. But the American saw him coming, seemed to have 360-degree awareness despite the physical limitations of his canopy and head position. And he executed this maneuver that I still don't have a name for. This combination of roll and pitch that changed his vector so dramatically that it looked like he'd hit invisible wall and bounced off in different direction. And the move brought him into position behind Nakamura, who was now screaming over the radio that he couldn't shake him, that he was trying every defensive maneuver he knew, but the American was staying with him like they were connected by invisible wire. Then the American did something that made my hands freeze on the stick, made me stop maneuvering entirely because I was too stunned to remember how to fly, which was that he climbed vertical while still on Nakamura's tail, climbed into the narrow corridor between cloud layers where the sunlight was pouring through. And as he climbed, he fired in burst pattern that tracked Nakamura's desperate evasive rolls, and the tracers looked like they were drawing lines in the air, like they were cutting paths through three-dimensional space. And where those lines intersected with Nakamura's flight path, there were sparks and smoke and pieces of aircraft separating from the whole, and Nakamura's Zero began falling not in controlled descent, but in flat spin that meant the tail was damaged, meant control surfaces weren't responding, meant he was dead unless he could bail out. And I saw the canopy jettison and saw Nakamura's body separate from the tumbling aircraft, and saw his parachute deploy, and felt simultaneous relief that he'd survived and rage that this American rookie had just shot down one of Japan's best pilots, like it was training exercise rather than mortal combat. But what happened next was the moment that changed everything. The moment that made me understand that we weren't just fighting skilled pilots anymore. We were fighting something that existed beyond skill, something that looked like natural law expressing itself through human agency. And the American at the top of his vertical climb, in this column of pure sunlight, where visibility was perfect, and the sky was divided into illuminated corridor surrounded by dark cloud walls, he rolled inverted and pulled into a dive that brought him down through the same space he'd just climbed through. And the speed he built up in that dive was enormous, was terminal velocity or beyond. And the angle was so steep that it looked less like flying and more like falling with style. And as he descended through the light column, he created this contrail so dense and so perfectly straight that it looked like someone had taken blade and drawn line through the sky, had cut the clouds open to reveal the blue space behind them. And the contrail didn't dissipate immediately like normal contrails do, didn't spread and dissolve. Instead, it held its shape, held this knife-edge precision that divided the sky into before and after, into what was possible before that moment and what became possible after, and through the gap he'd cut I could see the ocean far below, could see the way sunlight was hitting the water, could see individual wave patterns, and it felt like he'd opened door or torn veil, had revealed that the sky was thinner than we thought, was permeable in ways we hadn't imagined. He pulled out of the dive with turn radius that should have torn his wings off, should have exceeded the structural limits of any aircraft ever built. And the sound his Corsair made was this deep, resonant howl that I could hear over my own engine noise, over the wind, over the radio static, this sound like metal screaming or like atmosphere being torn. And he came up behind me before I could react, before I could process that he'd gone from vertical dive to position on my 6 in the span of seconds that felt like single heartbeat. And I knew I was dead, knew that this was the moment my war ended, but instead of firing, he pulled alongside me, matched my speed and altitude, and I could see him through the canopy, could see that he was young, couldn't have been more than 20, and he looked at me, made direct eye contact, and for maybe 3 seconds we flew formation together like we were on the same side. like we were squadron mates demonstrating synchronized flight, and then he waggled his wings, which was pilot signal for friendly acknowledgement, and he accelerated away, climbed back into the clouds, and disappeared into that cut he'd made in the sky. And I was left flying alone over the Solomon Islands, with my aircraft damaged, and my wingmen shot down, and my understanding of reality fundamentally altered. The flight back to base took 2 hours. 2 hours of checking instruments and watching for more American aircraft, and trying to maintain altitude with damaged wing that was affecting my Zero's handling characteristics. And during that entire flight, I couldn't stop thinking about the moment when the American had flown beside me and looked at me like he was checking to see if I was okay, like he was confirming that I was human before deciding what to do with me. And I realized that the reason he'd spared me wasn't mercy or compassion, but something more complex. Was that he'd recognized in me a fellow pilot who understood that what we'd just witnessed together was extraordinary, was something that transcended the war and the flags we fought under and the political abstractions that had brought us to that moment. He'd shown me what was possible when talent met opportunity, met the right combination of circumstances. And by sparing me, he'd ensured that someone would remember, would carry the story of what he'd done, would understand that the sky had changed hands not through numbers or technology, but through the emergence of someone who flew the way Mozart played piano or Hokusai painted waves, as natural expression of ability that existed independent of training or experience. When I landed, the squadron leader demanded explanation for why I'd returned alone, why Nakamura was floating in the ocean waiting for rescue, and Yoshida had crashed on an uninhabited island and would need extraction team. And I tried to describe what happened, but the words wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't arrange themselves into narrative that made sense even to my own ears. And I could see the squadron leader's expression shifting from concern to suspicion, to the particular disappointment that comes from thinking someone you trusted has failed you. He asked if I'd been afraid, asked if I'd retreated when I should have pressed attack. And I told him no, told him I'd fought as hard as I knew how to fight, and it hadn't been enough because the American was better, was operating at level that our training hadn't prepared us for. And the squadron leader told me that was impossible, that no rookie American could outfly a veteran Zero pilot, that I was making excuses for failure. And I stopped arguing because I realized that he needed to believe I'd failed through cowardice or incompetence, rather than because I'd encountered something that invalidated everything he believed about Japanese aerial superiority. They sent me to flight surgeon, who asked questions about stress and fatigue and whether I'd been sleeping properly, whether I'd been having nightmares or experiencing intrusive thoughts, and I answered honestly that yes, I'd been having nightmares since long before that morning's engagement, but that what I'd witnessed wasn't hallucination or stress-induced delusion, but actual event that had happened in physical reality with consequences that could be verified by checking the damage to my aircraft and interviewing Nakamura and Yoshida once they were recovered. The flight surgeon made notes and suggested that I take 3 days of rest, 3 days to recover from combat fatigue, and I accepted the rest because I needed time to think, needed time to process what I'd seen and what it meant for the war, and for my understanding of my own abilities and limitations. Nakamura was recovered the next day by seaplane, was suffering from exposure, but was otherwise uninjured. And when we talked privately about the engagement, he confirmed everything I'd described, said that the American had flown like someone who'd made deal with supernatural forces, had moved through space in ways that seemed choreographed rather than improvised, and Yoshida, when he was finally extracted 4 days later, said the same thing. said he'd never seen anything like it and hoped he'd never see anything like it again, because it meant that everything we'd believed about our training and discipline and spiritual preparation was insufficient when confronted with raw, natural talent operating at peak expression. The official report classified the engagement as inconclusive, noted that we'd encountered single American fighter and had failed to destroy it due to mechanical malfunctions that had forced 2 of our aircraft to withdraw, and there was no mention of the American's capabilities or the way he'd flown or the contrail that had cut the sky like blade revealing spaces beyond. And I understood that the command structure couldn't acknowledge what we'd seen, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that we were losing not just battles, but the fundamental advantage we'd built our strategy around, which was the belief that Japanese pilots were superior to American pilots in ways that mattered more than technology or numbers. The story spread through the squadron anyway, spread through informal channels, the way all true stories spread, even when official channels deny them. And other pilots started reporting similar encounters, started describing Americans who flew differently from the majority, who demonstrated abilities that seemed impossible given their flight hours and experience levels. And gradually, we developed this mythology around these pilots, started calling them things that translated roughly to sky cutters or blade flyers, started treating them as singular phenomena rather than representatives of systematic American improvement in training or tactics. I flew another 6 months before my Zero was shot down by anti-aircraft fire during ground attack mission, and I spent the rest of the war in hospital recovering from burns that had destroyed most of the skin on my left arm and left side of my face. And during those months of recovery, I had time to think about what the American rookie had taught me that morning over the Solomon Islands, which was that excellence exists independent of preparation, that some people are born with abilities that can't be replicated through discipline or training, and that recognizing this excellence in others requires setting aside ego and national pride and all the stories we tell ourselves about why we deserve to win. I never learned the American's name, never found out if he survived the war or died in some later engagement, never discovered whether he continued flying with that same impossible grace, or whether what I'd witnessed was single perfect moment that could never be repeated. But I've carried the memory of that contrail, cutting through the sky for more than 40 years now, carried it through Japan's surrender and occupation and reconstruction and eventual re-emergence as peaceful nation. And I've come to see that moment as the instant when the war's outcome became inevitable, not because of atomic bombs or strategic bombing or any of the macro-historical forces that historians cite, but because that American rookie represented something we couldn't match, no matter how much we believed in our cause or how disciplined our training was. I'm 79 years old, living in Osaka again where I started, and most of the men I flew with are dead, and I'm telling this story because I've decided that truth matters more than national pride, that there's value in acknowledging when you've witnessed greatness, even when that greatness belonged to someone who was trying to kill you. And maybe somewhere in America there's an old man who remembers that morning over the Solomon Islands when he flew alone against 3 Zeros and cut the sky like blade and spared the one pilot who understood what he'd done. If he's still alive, I want him to know that I remember, that I've carried that memory with respect and wonder, that he taught me something about the nature of talent and excellence that I couldn't have learned any other way, and that sometimes the most important lessons of war come not from victory or defeat, but from the moments when you witness someone operating at level that makes you understand how far human ability can extend when circumstances align perfectly with natural gift. Comment where you're watching from and subscribe. The sky remembers what the world forgets.